Clean the upstairs bathroom, and don't sit with the investors," my daughter-in-law said loud enough for the entire living room to hear. And for a moment, I honestly wondered if she had mistaken me for someone she hired off an app. I was still holding the housewarming gift I had wrapped the night before, a crystal serving bowl I'd driven 20 miles to pick up because she once mentioned liking that pattern, and the ribbon suddenly felt foolish in my hands. I had arrived 10 minutes earlier, expecting a hug from my son and maybe a tour of the new place, a 3,200 square foot colonial in a gated community just outside Denver, the kind of home Daniel used to point at as a boy and say, "One day, Mom." Instead, Vanessa stood in the center of the foyer in a fitted navy dress, smiling at a cluster of sharply dressed guests, and gestured toward the hallway, as if assigning tasks. A few of the investors she mentioned glanced at me, polite but puzzled, their eyes moving from my sensible low heels to the gift bag in my hand, trying to make sense of where I fit. Daniel gave a short laugh, the kind he uses when he's uncomfortable, and said, "Mom, it's just been crazy today," as though that explained why his 72-year-old mother was being directed toward a toilet brush. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to repeat herself. I simply nodded once, set my purse down by the staircase, and walked toward the hallway she indicated. The scent of catered hors d'oeuvres drifted after me, rosemary, garlic, something buttery, and I could hear the low hum of conversation swelling again as soon as I stepped out of sight. 2 days earlier, I had stood in my own kitchen, polishing that crystal bowl until it shone, telling myself how proud my late husband would have been to see our son hosting people like this. I had even ironed my pale blue blazer, the one Daniel bought me for Mother's Day 3 years ago, wanting to look appropriate, respectable, like the mother of the homeowner. As I passed the framed photos lining their hallway, engagement pictures, a beach vacation, Daniel in a tailored suit, I noticed there wasn't a single photo of our old house, the one his father and I paid off after 30 years of mortgage payments. The upstairs bathroom door was half open. It was spotless, of course. White marble counters, plush monogram towels, a faint scent of eucalyptus from a decorative candle. There was nothing to clean. I stood there, looking at my reflection in the wide mirror, at the silver in my hair and the faint lines around my mouth, and I realized the instruction had never been about hygiene. It was about position, about where I was allowed to sit and where I was not. Downstairs, laughter erupted at something Vanessa said, bright and confident. I smoothed my blazer, lifted my chin, and instead of reaching for any cleaning supplies, I quietly closed the bathroom door behind me and took out my phone, because if they wanted to decide who belonged in that house, they were about to be reminded exactly who helped put them there. I did not call anyone right away. Instead, I stood there in that pristine bathroom, staring at the marble countertop that probably cost more per square foot than the linoleum Daniel grew up on, and I let the silence settle into me. Downstairs, I could hear Vanessa's voice rising and falling, polished and confident as she told a story about how they had worked so hard to get here. Worked so hard. I remembered the afternoon 3 years ago when Daniel sat at my kitchen table, shoulders slumped, explaining that the bank would not approve the full mortgage without a stronger financial guarantee. I remembered the envelope I slid across to him, the one containing $180,000 from my late husband's life insurance policy. I had told him it was not a loan. I had told him it was a head start. What I had not told him was that I insisted on signing the escrow documents myself. I had insisted on a clause, quiet and unremarkable, placed neatly among the legal paragraphs, a clause that ensured my contribution was recognized as protected equity. At the time, Daniel kissed my cheek and called me cautious. Vanessa called it unnecessary. Now, standing in that bathroom I was supposedly meant to clean, I pulled up the email thread from my attorney, Mr. Caldwell, the one labeled Whitmore Property Agreement. My reflection in the mirror looked steady. Older, yes, but steady. I typed a brief message. I am at the house. I need you to confirm the ownership terms in writing. I pressed send before I could second-guess myself. A moment later, my phone vibrated softly in my hand, the familiar chime sounding almost too loud in the tiled room. He responded quickly, as if he had been expecting this day all along. The agreement remains active. Your equity stake is secured. Any hostile or exclusionary conduct tied to your financial contribution may trigger review. Hostile or exclusionary conduct. I repeated the phrase quietly to myself. Downstairs, another wave of laughter erupted. I imagined Vanessa guiding her guests through the open-concept kitchen, gesturing toward the oversized island, explaining the quartz countertops, the custom cabinetry, the 6-burner gas range. I wondered if she mentioned where the down payment came from. I wondered if Daniel ever told them that his mother had refinanced her own home to ensure he could stand in that foyer tonight and shake hands with men in tailored suits. I slipped my phone back into my purse and turned the bathroom faucet on briefly, letting the water run just long enough to justify my time upstairs. The mirror fogged slightly, blurring my reflection, and for a second I saw not the woman Vanessa had dismissed, but the younger version of myself who once worked double shifts at a department store to afford Daniel's soccer cleats and school trips. I turned the faucet off, dried my hands carefully on a monogrammed towel, and straightened my blazer. I was not a cleaning service. I was not an embarrassment to be hidden away while investors sipped sparkling water in the living room. I opened the bathroom door and paused at the top of the staircase. From there I could see the gathering below, the warm glow of recessed lighting reflecting off polished hardwood floors. Vanessa stood at the center, radiant and composed, Daniel at her side. He looked up just then, and our eyes met. There was a flicker there, something uncertain, something almost apologetic. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply began to walk down the stairs, one measured step at a time, carrying with me not a cleaning cloth, but the quiet knowledge that the foundation of this house was not as solely theirs as they wanted everyone to believe. I reached the bottom of the staircase with the same steady pace I used years ago. When I walked into parent-teacher conferences alone after my husband passed away, calm on the outside, prepared on the inside. Conversations softened as I stepped back into the living room, not because I demanded attention, but because people instinctively notice when someone carries themselves differently. Vanessa's smile flickered for half a second before she recovered. "Oh, good," she said lightly, glancing at my empty hands. "All set upstairs?" The question hung in the air, delicate and sharp at the same time. I met her gaze without raising my voice. "Yes," I replied. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Daniel shifted beside her, adjusting his jacket, avoiding the space between us. One of the investors, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses, extended his hand to me. "And you are?" he asked politely. "I am Margaret Whitmore," I said, placing my gift on the entry table with quiet precision. "Daniel's mother." I did not add more. I did not need to. The man nodded respectfully, but I noticed how Vanessa quickly redirected the conversation back to projected returns and expansion plans, carefully guiding attention away from me, as though I were an inconvenient detail in her presentation. I stood there listening, catching phrases about equity, leverage, long-term positioning. Words that once meant little to the boy who needed help with algebra at the kitchen table. Words that now floated easily from his mouth while he spoke about the property as if it were entirely the product of his ambition. I felt no urge to interrupt. Instead, I watched the room. The recessed lights reflected off polished floors, off wine glasses balanced between manicured fingers. The catered trays circulated smoothly. It was a well-orchestrated evening, almost flawless. Vanessa eventually turned back to me with a measured smile. "Margaret, maybe you would be more comfortable in the kitchen," she suggested softly, though the softness carried instruction. "We are discussing business matters." There it was again. Placement. Position. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. "Business matters?" I repeated gently. "Then perhaps I should stay." Daniel finally looked directly at me, and in his expression I saw something unsettled, something beginning to surface. "Mom," he said quietly, "it is just an informal conversation." I nodded once. "Of course," I answered. "Informal conversations about formal investments." The investor with the silver-rimmed glasses glanced between us, curiosity sharpening his attention. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "were you involved in the original acquisition?" The room grew subtly still. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Daniel inhaled as if preparing to speak, but I answered first, my tone even. "Yes," I said. "I was." I did not elaborate. I did not recount the escrow meeting or the wire transfer or the clause embedded in careful legal language. I simply allowed the statement to exist. Vanessa let out a small laugh, thin and controlled. "Margaret helped with a little support early on," she said quickly. "But Daniel and I handled the rest." I tilted my head slightly. Support can take many forms, I replied. Sometimes it is advice. Sometimes it is capital. No one laughed this time. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The investor nodded thoughtfully, as if recalibrating an internal calculation. I reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and held it calmly, not drinking, just standing. I did not need to raise my voice to be heard. I did not need to argue to shift the atmosphere. The foundation of that house had already shifted the moment I walked back down those stairs, and for the first time that evening, it was not me who felt out of place. The silence that followed my last sentence did not explode, it tightened. It was the kind of quiet that makes people reconsider what they thought they understood about a room. Vanessa's fingers curled slightly around the stem of her wine glass, and Daniel cleared his throat as if searching for language that would smooth over something he had not anticipated becoming visible. I took a small sip of sparkling water, letting the faint fizz settle on my tongue, giving them time to decide how they wanted to reposition me. Well, Vanessa said finally, her tone carefully bright. We are all grateful for family support, of course. She emphasized the word support as if shrinking it down to something decorative. I did not challenge her. I simply looked at Daniel. Do you remember the afternoon at the bank? I asked gently. His eyes shifted, just for a moment. He remembered. He had been nervous then, tapping his pen against the loan officer's desk, explaining projected income streams and future growth. I had been the one who leaned forward and said, "We are prepared to secure the difference." The loan officer had smiled at me differently after that, respectfully, as if I were not just a mother in the room, but a participant. "Mom," Daniel said now, lowering his voice slightly, "this is not the time." "It is precisely the time," I replied, still calm. "When business is being discussed, clarity is appropriate." The investor with the silver-rimmed glasses folded his arms loosely, listening with more interest than before. Vanessa stepped closer to Daniel, a subtle move that might have looked affectionate to an outsider, but felt strategic to me. "Margaret," she said, "we appreciate everything you have done. Truly. But tonight is about moving forward." I nodded slowly. "Forward movement," I said, "rests on solid foundations." I let that sentence rest between us. I was not raising my voice. I was not embarrassing anyone. I was stating something undeniable. My phone vibrated softly inside my purse. I did not look at it immediately. I did not need to. I already knew what it would say. Instead, I reached into my bag and withdrew a neatly folded copy of the property summary that Mr. Caldwell had once mailed to me for my records. I had brought it that evening without fully admitting to myself why. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases against the edge of the kitchen island. "For the sake of transparency," I said evenly, "my contribution is formally documented as protected equity in this property." Daniel's face shifted from discomfort to something closer to realization. Vanessa's composure thinned, just slightly. "Margaret," she said under her breath, "this is not necessary." "It becomes necessary," I answered quietly, "when I am instructed to clean bathrooms in a home where my investment is foundational." No one spoke for several seconds. The investors exchanged brief glances. The word investment had changed the narrative in the room. I was no longer an aging mother hovering awkwardly near the staircase. I was a stakeholder. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the same gesture he used as a teenager when he knew he had misjudged a situation. "Mom, that was not what Vanessa meant," he said. I met his eyes. "Intent does not erase impact," I replied. My phone vibrated again. This time I glanced down. The message from Mr. Caldwell was short and direct, documentation attached. Equity percentage confirmed at 28%. I placed the phone face down on the counter. I did not announce the number. I did not need to. Vanessa understood the implications before anyone else did. The evening had begun with me being sent upstairs to make myself invisible. Now I stood in the center of the kitchen, not louder than before, not angrier, just clearer. The foundation of that house was no longer theoretical. It had a percentage. And for the first time since I walked through the front door, Daniel looked at me not as an inconvenience, but as someone he had underestimated. The air in the kitchen felt different now, not heavier, just more honest. Numbers have a way of removing illusion, and 28% was not an abstract sentiment. It was measurable. It was recorded. Vanessa set her glass down with careful control, as if too much pressure might crack it. "We never intended for you to feel excluded," she said, her tone smooth but thinner than before. I studied her face, the flawless makeup, the steady posture, the calculation behind her composure. Intent, I replied quietly, is demonstrated through action. Daniel stepped closer to the island, lowering his voice so the guests could not fully hear. Mom, we can talk about this later, he said. Privately. I looked at him for a long moment. I remembered the boy who once needed help tying his tie before his first high school debate, the way his hands trembled with nerves. I remembered standing in the bleachers at his college graduation, clapping until my palms ached. Daniel, I said gently. This conversation became public the moment I was given instructions as if I were staff. The investors were no longer pretending not to listen. The man with the silver-rimmed glasses spoke carefully. If there are equity partners, he said, it is important for us to understand the structure. His tone was neutral, professional. Vanessa forced a polite smile. It is a family matter, she insisted. It does not affect operational plans. I turned slightly toward the investor. It affects ownership, I said. Ownership affects decision-making. Decision-making affects investment security. I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize the words. I simply placed them on the counter alongside the documents. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound almost inaudible. Mom, he said again, this time without defensiveness. Why did you never tell us you would use that clause? I held his gaze. Because I never imagined I would need to. The truth settled between us more heavily than any accusation. I had not secured my equity to control them. I had secured it to protect myself from exactly this kind of dismissal. Vanessa straightened her shoulders. You are making this uncomfortable, she said under her breath. I did not begin this discomfort, I answered evenly. I responded to it. For a moment, no one spoke. The house, with its open floor plan and high ceilings, felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. I picked up the crystal bowl I had brought and placed it gently on the island. This was a gift, I said quietly. Not a transaction, but my contribution to this home was never a gift. It was an investment in my son's future. Daniel looked at the documents, then at me, then at Vanessa. I saw the shift happening behind his eyes, the recalculation, the realization that the narrative he had allowed to form was incomplete. How much? He asked finally, his voice steady but subdued. I did not hesitate. 28%, I said. The number did not echo. It did not need to. It landed cleanly. One of the investors nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. Vanessa's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the recognition that control had slipped slightly from her grasp. I folded the papers neatly and returned them to my purse. I am not here to embarrass you, I said calmly. I am here to be respected. I let the sentence stand on its own. There was no shouting, no raised hands, only clarity. And clarity, I had learned, can rearrange a room far more effectively than volume ever could. No one applauded. No one argued. The room did not fracture into drama the way people expect when money is mentioned. Instead, it shifted into something quieter and more serious. Investors do not respond to raised voices. They respond to risk. And for the first time that evening, risk had a name. Daniel's name. Vanessa inhaled slowly, as if recalibrating her next sentence with the same precision she used to curate the catering menu. This does not change our trajectory, she said carefully, turning slightly toward the guests. Margaret's contribution was appreciated, but Daniel and I managed the property independently. I watched her choice of words. Appreciated. Manage independently. It was impressive how quickly she attempted to regain narrative control. I did not interrupt. Instead, I addressed Daniel directly. Independence, I said calmly, is strongest when it acknowledges its origins. He swallowed, the gesture subtle but visible to me because I have known his expression since he was 5 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. Mom, he said, softer now. I did not realize you felt dismissed. I held his gaze. I felt reassigned, I answered. There is a difference. The investors exchanged another look. One of them cleared his throat. If there are structured equity terms, he said professionally, we would need disclosure before proceeding with any expansion. Vanessa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was no longer about embarrassment. It was about leverage. Daniel turned fully toward me now, not as a son irritated by interference, but as a businessman recognizing oversight. What exactly does the clause allow? He asked. I did not rush my answer. It allows review of ownership rights if my equity is undermined or publicly disregarded, I said evenly. It ensures that my contribution cannot be treated as invisible. Silence settled again, but this time it was not uncomfortable. It was contemplative. Vanessa stepped closer to Daniel, lowering her voice. We can clarify this later, she whispered, though everyone could still hear the tension in her tone. Daniel did not immediately respond to her. Instead, he looked at me, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not anger, not resentment. Recognition. Recognition that the story they had been presenting was incomplete. I placed my sparkling water glass back onto the tray of a passing server. I did not come here to destabilize your evening, I said quietly. I came because I was invited as your mother. I paused, letting the weight of that word rest between us. Mother. But if I am present only as labor, I continued, then we must redefine presence. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. The investors were no longer smiling politely. They were assessing. Daniel straightened his posture, the way he does before making a decision. Thank you for bringing clarity, he said finally, addressing both me and the room. We will review the ownership structure formally before moving forward with any partnership. It was a professional statement. Controlled. Appropriate. But beneath it, I heard something personal. Accountability. Vanessa's composure did not crumble. She did not raise her voice. She simply nodded tightly, the elegant hostess maintaining form even as the script shifted. I picked up my purse from the edge of the counter. That is all I needed, I said gently. Not control, not attention, just acknowledgment. Daniel stepped toward me as if to say something more, but words did not immediately come. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain not about business, but about himself. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder. The house still gleamed under warm recessed lighting. The catered food still circulated. On the surface, nothing had broken. But foundations do not crack loudly. They shift quietly beneath the structure above them. And as I walked toward the front door, I understood that I had not cleaned a bathroom that night. I had cleaned a misunderstanding. One that would no longer allow me to be placed upstairs and out of sight. I reached the front door before Daniel did. My hand rested briefly on the brushed nickel handle, cool and solid beneath my palm, and for a moment I simply stood there, listening to the soft murmur of resumed conversation behind me. Investors have a remarkable ability to recalibrate. Once uncertainty is acknowledged, they move on to structure. Numbers. Terms. Protections. Vanessa's voice had already shifted back into hosting mode, measured and composed, as if the last 15 minutes had been a minor scheduling adjustment rather than a public correction. I opened the door slowly, letting in a draft of cool Colorado evening air. The sky had deepened into a clear navy blue, porch lights casting a soft glow across the manicured lawn. I stepped outside onto the wide stone entryway, and the quiet felt honest in a way the interior had not. Mom. Daniel's voice came from behind me before the door fully closed. I did not turn immediately. I allowed him to step out beside me. He looked older in that moment than he had earlier in the evening, not physically, but in awareness. The confidence he wore inside had been replaced by something reflective. I should have handled that differently, he said after a pause. I studied his face, searching not for apology, but for understanding. Handled what? I asked gently. He exhaled slowly. The comment. Upstairs. I should have stopped it. I nodded once. Yes, I said. There was no anger in my tone. Only clarity. He looked down at the stone beneath his shoes, then back at me. I did not think it was a big deal, he admitted. I thought it was just stress. I considered that carefully. Stress does not erase respect, I replied. It reveals it. The words settled between us, not sharp, but steady. Through the front window, I could see Vanessa moving gracefully between guests, smiling, gesturing, maintaining control of the narrative. Daniel followed my gaze. She did not mean to diminish you, he said, quieter now. I met his eyes. Intent, I repeated, does not erase impact. He swallowed, the repetition landing heavier this time. I never wanted you to feel like an outsider in my own house, he said. I let the phrase sit in the air. It is not only your house, I answered softly. He nodded slowly. I know, he said. And this time, I believed he did. The porch light hummed faintly above us. Cars lined the curb, polished and expensive, symbols of the world he was stepping into. The investors will ask questions, he said after a moment. About structure. About control. I did not flinch. They should, I said. Serious partners ask serious questions. He looked at me differently then. Not as someone interfering. Not as someone to manage. But as someone who understood leverage. What do you want? He asked finally. It was not defensive. It was direct. I folded my hands lightly in front of me. I want acknowledgment, I said. In private and in public. I want my contribution to be treated as real. And I want to never again be reassigned to a bathroom in a house where my name is written into the foundation. He winced slightly at that, not from offense, but from recognition. Inside, the front door opened briefly and closed again as a guest stepped out to take a phone call. The evening continued. The world did not collapse. I will fix this, Daniel said quietly. I studied him for a long second. Do not fix it, I replied. Understand it. The difference mattered. He nodded once more, slower this time. I adjusted my purse strap on my shoulder and looked down the driveway, at the neat row of hedges and the quiet suburban street beyond. I had not raised my voice that night. I had not created a scene. But something had. Shifted permanently. And as Daniel stood beside me under the porch light, I understood that respect is not granted automatically with age. It is maintained through boundaries. And tonight, I had drawn one clearly enough that even he could see it. Daniel and I stood under the porch light a moment longer, the quiet between us no longer tense but thoughtful, and then he reached for the door handle and held it open for me in a way he had not done when I first arrived. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but I noticed it. When we stepped back inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around us again, along with the low murmur of resumed conversation. Vanessa glanced toward the entryway immediately. Her posture remained elegant, shoulders straight, smile intact, but her eyes sharpened when she saw Daniel return at my side rather than ahead of me. He did not walk past me this time. He remained beside me. The investors paused mid-sentence, sensing the subtle reconfiguration of the room. Daniel cleared his throat, not loudly, but enough to gather attention. Before we continue, he said evenly, I want to clarify something regarding the ownership structure of this property. The room quieted without protest. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly, but she did not interrupt him. My mother holds a documented equity stake in this home, Daniel continued, his voice steady, professional. It is significant, and it will be fully disclosed in any future agreements. There was no embarrassment in his tone now, only acknowledgment. The investor with the silver-rimmed glasses nodded once, satisfied not by drama, but by transparency. Vanessa inclined her head gracefully. Of course, she said smoothly. Family investment has always been part of our foundation. I did not correct her phrasing. I did not need to. The difference between part of and foundational had already been demonstrated. Daniel looked at me briefly, not for approval, but for alignment. I gave a small nod. That was enough. The conversation resumed, but the energy had shifted from presentation to partnership. Questions became more precise. Terms were mentioned more carefully. I moved slightly to the side of the island, no longer at the edge of the room, but not at its center either. I did not seek the spotlight. I sought balance. Vanessa approached me quietly while Daniel answered a question about projected quarterly growth. Margaret, she said softly, maintaining composure. If my comment earlier came across as dismissive, that was not my intention. I met her gaze without hostility. Placement communicates more than intention, I replied calmly. Tonight you place me upstairs. She held my eyes for a moment, measuring the weight of that sentence. It will not happen again, she said after a pause. I believed she understood the stakes now, even if pride resisted the admission. That is all I require, I answered. We did not smile at each other. We did not need to. Across the room, Daniel finished outlining the next steps with confidence that felt less performative and more grounded. He was no longer presenting an image. He was managing a structure. The crystal bowl I had brought sat at the center of the kitchen island, catching the overhead light. It no longer looked misplaced. It looked deliberate, a symbol of contribution rather than decoration. One of the investors turned toward me briefly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said respectfully, it is good to see families with clear agreements. I inclined my head slightly. Clarity prevents confusion, I replied. The evening continued, not as originally scripted, but as revised. No one mentioned bathrooms. No one suggested relocation. I stood where I chose to stand, speaking when necessary, silent when appropriate. And as the gathering carried on beneath recessed lighting and polished ceilings, I understood something simple and steady. Respect is not demanded through volume. It is established through boundaries that are visible, documented, and calmly enforced. Tonight, mine had been. By the time the evening began to wind down, the house no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a structure under review, steadier now that its lines had been properly drawn. Guests collected their coats near the entryway, offering measured handshakes and professional smiles. Conversations were quieter, more precise. Transparency has that effect. It replaces speculation with structure. I remained near the kitchen island for a few moments longer, watching Daniel walk one of the investors toward the door, speaking with a tone that was confident without being inflated. When he returned, he did not avoid me. He did not rush past me. He stood directly in front of me, shoulders squared, expression clear. "Thank you for staying," he said simply. There was no defensiveness left in his voice, only recognition. I nodded once. "Thank you for clarifying," I replied. Across the room, Vanessa supervised the final details with composed efficiency, thanking guests, collecting empty glasses, maintaining the image of control she valued so carefully. When the last car pulled away and the front door finally closed, the house fell into a quieter, more honest silence. The recessed lights seemed softer now. The polished floors reflected only the three of us. Vanessa approached first. Her posture was still upright, but no longer sharp. "I did not intend to diminish you," she said again, this time without performance. I met her eyes steadily. "Intent matters less than placement," I answered. "And tonight, placement changed." She gave a small nod, accepting the truth of it even if pride resisted. Daniel stepped closer, standing between us, but not shielding either side. "This house stands because of all of us," he said carefully. I lost sight of that. I studied him for a moment. "You did not lose sight," I said gently. "You allowed someone else to define it for you." He absorbed that quietly. There was no accusation in my tone, only clarity. I picked up my purse from the counter and glanced once more at the crystal bowl under the kitchen lights. It no longer looked like a hopeful offering from a mother trying to be included. It looked like what it was, a contribution placed deliberately in the center of the room. I turned toward the door, and this time Daniel walked with me without hesitation. Vanessa followed a step behind. At the threshold, I paused and looked back into the living room, at the high ceilings, the carefully arranged furniture, the home that symbolized ambition and growth. "I did not come here to compete," I said calmly. "I came here as your mother." Daniel nodded slowly. "And you will always be," he replied. The porch light flickered on automatically as the door opened, casting a steady glow across the stone steps. I stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling neither triumphant nor wounded, only settled. Daniel remained at the doorway. "We will revise the agreements," he said. "Properly. Together." I looked at him, seeing not the boy I once tied shoes for, and not the man who had overlooked me earlier, but someone standing between those versions, recalibrating. "Revision begins with respect," I said softly. "The documents will follow." He gave a small, understanding nod. I walked down the driveway toward my car, the sound of my heels steady against the pavement. I had not raised my voice. I had not created spectacle. Yet something essential had shifted. They would remember that evening not for the catered trays or the polished presentation, but for the moment the foundation spoke. And as I drove away under the dark Colorado sky, I understood that I had not cleaned a bathroom that night. I had simply reminded them who helped build the house.